Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Beckly Lecture for 2020. As usual, the Beckly Lecture is taking part as a fringe meeting of the Methodist Conference. And so we're delighted to welcome members of the Methodist Conference joining us this evening. But we're also delighted to welcome so many members who've been able to join us because we're online this year. We think possibly this is the largest membership we've ever had for a Beckly Lecture, so we're delighted that you're with us. My name's Rachel Lampard and I'm leader of the Joint Public Issues team. If you've not come across JPIT before, we are how the Methodist Church, the Baptist Union, the United Reformed Church and the Church of Scotland work together on issues of justice and peace. Our churches ask us to focus together on 6 hopes. Hopes for our society and for our world. And currently our work includes looking at the impact of COVID-19 on our society and particularly on the changing shape of poverty. It includes helping our churches to imagine what the future might look like, fair to people and to the planet, and the kind of choices that we need to make in order to get there. And then, of course, there's a range of work around ethical investment and nuclear weapons, the treatment of asylum seekers and refugees, and homelessness. But one of my roles in JPIT is as secretary to the Beckly Trust. And the Beckly Trust was set up in 1926 as a way of helping Methodists to reflect on the social implications of Christianity. It's continued since as a forum to help Methodists and others to engage with leading thinkers of the day, to reflect on current issues, be they political or social, economic or legal. And we've had speakers at past Beckly Lectures on issues such as law reform, religious freedom, social mobility, gambling, broadcasting. And the text and often the broadcast lecture themselves have been available on the JPIT website. Now, as this is a webinar, your face and your voice won't be heard, so really don't worry if you're still eating your tea. But you will be able to join in the conversation after the lecture. The lecture is going to last about 40 minutes, and then there's going to be half an hour for questions. Could I ask that you use the Q&A function on your screen? It's down at the bottom to ask your questions. There's also a chat function, which a number of you have discovered, and that's a great way of saying hello to everybody who's here. But if you pop your questions there, they tend to get lost because there are so many things going on in the chat. So if you want to ask a question of the speaker, could I ask that you put it in the Q&A function at any time during the lecture or afterwards. Please do tweet about the lecture, tweeting us at Public Issues and using the hashtag @Beckly2020. So we're absolutely delighted this evening to welcome the Revd Inderjit Bhogal to be our Beckly Lecturer for 2020. Inderjit will be known to many of you already. Born into a Sikh family in Nairobi, he moved with them to the West Midlands in the 1960s and was ordained a Methodist minister, I think 40 years ago this year. And since then, his ministry has been one that has focused on issues of justice and peace. He's been committed to practical interfaith work, for which he was awarded an OBE. He has built up the Cities of Sanctuary movement and worked for the better treatment of refugees and asylum seekers. And he has been committed to peacemaking. He was the leader of the Corrymeela Community in Northern Ireland and the recipient of the World Methodist Peace Award. And has this last weekend been appointed as the Honorary President to the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a leading Christian peacemaking charity. I've been privileged to know and to work with Inderjit now for a couple of decades, and I've seen his commitment to activism across many areas. It seems appropriate then that his title for today's lecture draws together many of the challenges that our world is facing today. Peace, pandemics and plastic bottles, prioritising the future. Inderjit Bhogal, thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, and greetings. It is being generally recognised that everything must change. COVID-19 has brought us globally to imagine a new world. It is never too late to commit oneself to building a better world, a world governed by justice, mercy, and humility. In church, it is always urgent to nurture the church as the body of Christ, where bruised, broken, and beautiful, all are equally welcome, equally valued, belong equally, truly reflecting all of us with our wondrous diversity in congregations and leadership, where all are worthy and no one is made to feel unworthy, where we rejoice in the fact that we are all human beings made in the image of God, one human race, one in Christ. So I greet you all in the name of Christ and wish upon you the peace and blessings of God. Behind me is a cross made for me by Desi, Mr. Do-It-All, at the Corrymeela Community Centre in Ballycastle, Northern Ireland. And then next to it is an image of a mother and a child, which are bought in Lampedusa. The refugee mother drowned in the Mediterranean Sea, and she gave birth to a child as she drowned. Both were dead when they were lifted out of the water. Such things are still happening in our world, and they break my heart. I want to share a few modest reflections with you to add to the discussions. I will be speaking on the wide-ranging theme of peace, pandemics, and plastic, and suggest that values of justice, mercy, and humility direct how we prioritize future action. I have retired, but I'm currently working with Churches Together in Britain and Ireland to develop and promote the idea of Church of Sanctuary, which envisages every church as a community that values and welcomes diversity, and is inclusive of all people, especially those who feel most marginalized, not least refugees. This is now my contribution to the City of Sanctuary movement. I was ordained 40 years ago, and 20 years ago I was president of the Methodist Conference. This time there was another president of the British Methodist Conference whose roots are elsewhere. Perhaps that will happen this year. Within the coronavirus pandemic and the mirror it has held up before us to see ourselves, the world has seen in full view the heart-rending and horrific murder of George Floyd under the knee of a policeman, gasping, "I can't breathe," exposing a killer in what the Reverend Al Sharpton has called the pandemic of racism. This has rightly given rise to a global Black Lives Matter protest within the restrictions of COVID-19. And in the context of social distance, people have been willing to take incredible risks to stand together peacefully, black and white, for justice. All peace organizations have to relate peace to the global pandemic and anger in matters of racism and air. Black Lives Matter has become a global message. The largest groups on the streets prior to the Black Lives Matter protests centered on climate change. Greta Thunberg draws attention of the world to the pandemic of climate crisis. Treat climate crisis like the crisis it is and give us a future, she insists. Young Methodists repeatedly call for climate justice. Life and clean air matter to us all. The agenda is immense, but these two are important priorities. Within COVID-19 and racism and injustices on which it has shone a light, we have witnessed remarkable responses which fill us with hope and also with horror. I express my deepest sorrow to families of all those who have died in hospitals, at home, in care homes, in streets, in deserts, in the sea. We need wisdom now for ethical choices on what is good and what is wrong, learning from history that what we choose to do or not to do now will affect generations to come after us. Peacemaking can be seen as a passive and soft option, but as Barack Obama said in a meeting I joined in Belfast, peacemaking is harder work than war making. So I want to begin with some thoughts on peacemaking. A regular image of the 21st century shows the journeys taken by people who have lost the protection of their own nations and who take long, dangerous journeys in their search for sanctuary and security. Wars create refugees. There are almost 80 million displaced people now. 90% of the people crossing borders for safety are people from countries in or close to conflict. This is the shameful reality of war. Wars are costly. Peace at international levels requires an end to war and killing. Conflict resolution and peacemaking in the 21st century is complex and includes negotiations, mediation, bargaining, conflict transformation, conflict resolution, UN peacekeeping strategies, preventative diplomacy, humanitarian interventions, justice and reconciliation work, disarmament, non-violence, and interfaith peace-building initiatives. What does peace mean to you? It is often said that the best biblical word for peace is shalom, which can be translated as wholeness or completeness. This suggests that peace is shattered when someone or something is missing, and that brokenness, not least in body and mind, is the opposite of peace. The Bible outlines many contexts of human conflict arising mostly from brokenness and fracture in relationships, symbolized, for example, in the hurt and broken relationships of Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Sarah and Hagar, Isaac and Ishmael, and different nations. Stories around Noah and the flood and the rainbow suggest that the relationship between humans and the environment is integral to peace and well-being. There are religious tensions around which is the most favored faith in the eyes of God. One suggestion explores sibling rivalry and the choices held out in the situations of Isaac but not Ishmael, Jacob but not Esau. These stories raise the question, who is the best? They hold up the option of superiors and inferiors. The stories in Hebrew scriptures pose the question, can it be true that though we are all made in the image of God, I am good but not you? God loves me but not you. Perhaps the key insight in the Adam and Eve story is that mutuality is central to all relationships and is bruised by selfishness, seeking only my satisfaction. Human beings have this in common, that selfishness mars our highest ideals. The question raised, how can we build peace and the best for ourselves and also for others? What is required? To love your neighbor as yourself. Two teenage women from Syria had no hesitation in stating what would make life better there. Stop the killing. An 11-year-old pupil from South Sudan gave me his vision for the future, a world without war. For those in situations of war and killing, peace means a cessation of war and killing. Greta Thunberg makes the protection of the environment the most urgent priority. World War II was seen as the end to all war. In 1989, with the demolition of the Berlin Wall, that symbolized the end of the Cold War, and there was hope of entering a new peaceful era. In 1990, Iraq invaded the neighboring state of Kuwait. The attacks on the World Trade Organization on 11th of September 2001 unleashed new wars, including the Iraq War in 2003 and the so-called War on Terrorism. There have been conflicts in Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia, Britain and Ireland, There is war in Syria, Yemen, South Sudan, and Somalia. Israel and Palestine remain locked in conflict. New wars loom. China and USA and India are baring their knuckles. Some analysts say that the world is more peaceful than ever before. Others say we are in a state of wars without end. There are important challenges that face us at local, national, and international level to pursue the path of peace. We can all play our part, for example, by being human and hospitable and always challenging hatred. See the image of God in the other, the stranger. Try to experience conflict from the perspective of the victim. Learn and always seek non-violent ways of conflict resolution. I am thankful for all those who over the years have opted for non-violence and borne witness to peacemaking. So I want to turn now to what I call the storm of the pandemics. COVID-19 has clarified for me wider pandemics, deeper diseases and wounds in human beings and the environment around us, namely hatred and climate degradation. Jesus applied the words, "Peace be still," to the stilling of the storm. In the words of an Indian poem, spring blossoms, but if autumn overwhelms spring, how will the flowers grow? Water puts out the fire, but if water becomes the fire, how will fire be put out? A boatman rows your ferry, but if the boatman sinks the boat, how will you survive? Don't blame the waves for the storm. The cause of the storm is not in the waves. The storm is in the winds, which move in unpredictable ways. There has to be international cooperation to find cures and ways through the coronavirus pandemic and ways to prevent the spread of similar outbreaks of disease. This is important and urgent, but the focus entirely on the virus in this pandemic is to look for the cause and the cure of the storm in the waves rather than in the direction of the wind. Jesus rebuked the wind to still the storm. What is the wind we are to rebuke if we are to achieve some semblance of peace? For me, the wind to rebuke includes two deeper pandemics: hatred between human beings based on difference and iniquitous inequalities, and climate degradation and change that threatens us all. So let's look at these two pandemics, wounds that cry out for healing. First, we look at hatred. If we are to build a better world and tackle climate change, we have to work together as human beings. We have to find ways to address human hatred that divides us. We can do this by being human with each other and by accommodating each other as human with our differences. This is the first restart button to press. In my experience of ministry, we have been wrestling with this in the Methodist Church in Britain for 40 years, and the struggle continues. I want to commend to you the work of people like Professor Anthony Reddy and Dr. Mukti Barton and the Reverend Israel Salvanayagam for further illuminations of some of this work. When I was ordained, there were only 5 Black Methodist presbyters in Britain. 5 years into ministry, I helped to initiate the Black Methodist Ministers Group, now called the Belonging Together Ministers Group, recognizing our diversity. The primary purpose of the group was to meet together, to share experience, to further education, and to support each other to be more effective in ministry. Now there are around 200 Black Methodist presbyters and deacons in the British Methodist Church, and not only do we need the group more than ever, but I would like to see it strengthened within the connectional budget to promote Black leadership. The Black Methodist Ministers Group worked with connectional colleagues to help produce a seminal report entitled Faithful and Equal, which was adopted by conference in 1987. This report named racism as the sin we must tackle and defined racism as allowing prejudice to determine the way power is used to the personal, social, or institutional detriment of ethnic minority individuals or communities. The wisdom of Dame Sybil Phoenix, instrumental in racism awareness training, was central to arriving at that definition. We were ahead of the game, and the many quite significant reports that emerged, the most wide-ranging of which was the Macpherson report of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. We were ahead of these. That report made 70 recommendations for change and gave a definition of institutional racism. Stephen Lawrence, a young Black Methodist, was murdered in a London street on the 22nd of April in 1993. Stephen's mother, Baroness Doreen Lawrence, has championed the cause of racial justice in Britain, and I was proud to invite her to address the conference when I was president. She spoke passionately about the need for justice and change. Here we are in 2020. We have made some progress, but we have an unfinished agenda. Conference has before it a call to an inclusive church. We must move beyond the white male-dominated model of church, which is so 19th century. I would like to see the diversity of the Methodist Church reflected in our senior roles. George Floyd's murder has named the endemic inequalities faced by Black and minority ethnic communities in health, in housing, education, and employment, migration, as racism. Why would our government want to create a hostile environment within immigration? And why treat the Windrush generation with such deep injustice and hostility? Why hostile? What does that do to fan wider hostility? The COVID-19 pandemic has uncovered the deep sickness of hatred and resulting inequalities of racism and the harm it does. We see that, for example, in the disproportionate number of people of Asian and African backgrounds who have died from COVID-19 in the UK and the USA. These groups of people are more affected, not only because they have been among the frontline carers, and in the words of a Public Health England report, amongst those who are in proximity to the infections and in occupations that are more likely to be exposed, but also because they were the least well protected. Many of them were also people from overseas on fragile work visas, who were also being required to pay an NHS levy for care themselves until this was reversed following a public outcry. These are the very people who have been the least valued and often the most vilified in opinions, who have been more likely to be undertaking virus-facing care work in hospitals and care homes, and who on Thursdays we applauded. Those at the deepest end of racist violence and abuse anywhere are Black people. The darker your skin, the deeper your hurt. This is a global fact in every community and in every walk of life. For me, tackling racism at its worst begins with tackling hatred, deeply rooted in concepts of racial differences and in which religious belief is so often co-opted to sanction hatred. I delight in human diversity. Human DNA shows an incredible mixing and intermingling amongst human beings throughout history. There is a fantastic variety in skin colors and deep visual beauty in them all. The skin color referred to as white is incredibly variable, as is the skin color of people of Asian or African or Aboriginal people of any nation. We reduce these variables to black and white. This remarkable diversity of people rooted in the global South is reduced to BAME, black and minority ethnic. That's like labeling all the immense variety of Indian cuisine as curry, which is as ludicrous as labeling all British food as gravy. There is no scientific basis to the argument that there are different races with one group superior to another. Science is affirming what theology has always insisted. Human beings are not people of different races. We should stop using terms like multiracial and mixed race. They don't make sense. Of course, we all carry the capacity for selfishness and have our biases and prejudice, and we hurt each other. But within our immense differences, we are one human race and incredibly alike. Life is precious to us all. We all require breath and blood in our bodies. Whoever you are, your well-being will be checked against the same rate of heartbeat and pulse. How did skin color come to be so embedded in discrimination? Of course, for our reflections, of significance for our reflections is the fact that, to quote a scholar in genetics, the emergence of scientific approach to human taxonomy coincided with the growth of European empires. Characterizing of different populations before the expansion of Europeans around the globe was more likely to be based on religion or language than on skin color. But with the birth and the growth of the era of scientific revolution, pigmentation became integral to the character of humans. Skin color came to be used to exercise power and prejudice to other human beings of a different and particularly darker skin tone, and to sanction subjugation of people. This development was integral to the development of the transatlantic slave trade 400 years ago and the subsequent history of racism. It is far easier to sell the case for occupation and enslavement if you are persuaded that the indigenous people are different, have different origins, and are qualitatively inferior to colonists. Scholars in the so-called Enlightenment period of history, the period of empire building and colonial expansion, helped to formulate the idea of fixed differences in human beings, primarily based on skin color, linking skin color to character and the ranking of human beings. Those with lighter skins were said to be more superior to those with darker skins. Here lie the roots of the supremacy of the color white. The idea of different races based on skin color was developed. Contemporary science has rejected these classifications, though they persist in many people's minds and views and opinions. Where we are now is that sciences refuse to show linear, discrete categorization of human beings. Rather, it reveals complexity in human history and life, which only increases with the movement, meandering, and migrations of people across the globe from about 70,000 years ago. The baseline of the most recent science of human genetics is that all human beings share all their DNA, and of all the attempts over the centuries to place humans in distinct races, none succeeds. Genetics refuses to comply with these artificial and superficial categories. While theology insists we are all made in the image of God, it is a sacrilege that religion has introduced the idea of clean and dirty, holy and profane into the mix. People who are like us are clean, others are dirty. Whiteness is good and pure, blackness is seen negatively. White has come to be associated with power and privilege and goodness, black with subjugation, denial and badness. I reject this reasoning. Black is beautiful. This is why it is important to stand by Black Lives Matter. To recognize Black Lives Matter is to agree all lives matter. Racism is an obscenity, a negation of our humanity. It is a painful form of violence which is dehumanizing and degrading. We all have to stand and work together, all of us, with all our skin variables, to resist and stop racism. Stop stereotyping people. Take a persistent stand against racism. The most repeated ethical command in the Bible, to love the stranger, challenges us all to see the image of God in those who are different from us. I want to turn now to climate change and extreme weather and plastic bottles. "25 years ago, I visited El Salvador, where I met Jesuit pastor and theologian John Sobrino. I sat with him in his office for conversation, and at one point I asked him what the priorities of the church should be now. Life and clean air was his immediate reply. That was not the answer I expected, but I found it insightful, and I've remained persuaded by it. It is the need of our times, life and clean air. The number of deaths around the world from COVID-19 globally is alarming. However, according to the World Health Organization, 7 million people die because of air pollution in a normal year on planet Earth. And as with COVID-19, the most vulnerable are always at the greatest risk, but all of us are affected. Over 90% of us are breathing unsafe air. This exceeds World Health Organization pollution guidelines. Air pollution is a weapon of mass destruction. We must stop polluting the air. It is important to arrive at zero carbon emissions much sooner than 2050, and that requires economies and lifestyles that are not fossil fuel based. In the name of progress to our own demise, we are poisoning ourselves. The risk to poorer communities increased because they are more likely to be living near more environmentally hazardous sites, such as highways and waste disposal centers. Air pollution harms people living in Asia, Africa, and the Pacific and Central America. The poorest ones are always the first to feel the heat. The next 20 to 30 years will see increasing danger from extreme weather, and that will increase refugees as a result of this. Plastic is an increasing hazard in the environment. Plastic is cheap and durable, but a deep menace to animal, aquatic, and human life. It is not biodegradable, and according to one study, an average person eats 70,000 pieces of microplastic a year. Since it was invented in the 1950s, over 8 billion tons of plastic have been produced, and practically every piece of it is still with us in some form. 1 million plastic bottles are bought around the world every minute. Less than half of the bottles purchased in 2016 were recycled, most ending up in landfills and oceans. According to the Recycle Rebuild website, only 9% of plastic has ever been recycled, 12% burned, and the remaining 79% has ended up in landfills and the environment. In your recent walks, you may also have come across growing numbers of plastic gloves discarded along footpaths. Plastic is the most common form of marine litter worldwide. At least 8 million pieces of plastic are ending up in oceans every day. It is a menace to marine life, as we have seen from Blue Planet programs. And we do not yet know how long the long terms of plastic will remain in our body. Why do we keep producing it when we know it is so harmful to every human and natural system? I want to direct you to Dame Ellen MacArthur Foundation. Ellen MacArthur learned on her boat expeditions that when she went out on a boat for 3 months, she only had what she had and had to survive on that. She says on her website, "What we have out there is all we have. There is no more." The message of her foundation is that the current systems of the world are no longer working for businesses, people, or the environment. In the current system, we take resources, we make things out of them, and we waste a lot. This is the linear economy. She argues for a circular economy based on principles of designing out waste and pollution and regenerating natural systems. The onus is on industrial ethics much more than on individual lifestyle. The plastic and air pollution pandemic is part of the racism pandemic. Stopping plastic and air pollution is part of what it means to love God and your neighbor as yourself. God's first instructions to human beings, according to Genesis 1:28, is to be fruitful and to care for creation with wisdom. Well, I want to turn now to setting the priorities for peace and life. And I want to stress 3 values by which we can set our priorities and help to play our part to build a better world for all. And I turn to the Bible for this rather than to any body of scholarship or any scholar. What does God require? Micah chapter 6, verse 8. God has told you, O mortal, what is good. And what does God require of you? But to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. So we turn to these 3 values outlined here. First, do justice. Justice is the cry of our times. We have seen many banners with the words, "No justice, no peace." The demand of justice is the abundance and benefits of life, the fullness of life for all, without discrimination and deprivation. This is the persistent call of the prophets of ancient Israel. In the words of Isaiah, God is laying a foundation stone and will make justice the line and righteousness the plummet. And in the words of Amos, God despises the worship of people who tolerate injustice and longs for the day when justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Whenever people work in favor of and are willing to suffer and perhaps even die for justice, understood as simple fairness, equity, and parity among people in things that enhance human dignity and well-being, they are standing on the foundation stone established by God of justice. This justice challenges the violence of poverty, racism, sexism, homophobia, and every form of domination, discrimination, oppression, and war. In Genesis 18, 17 to 19, justice and righteousness are linked and mean the same thing. The way of God is revealed as doing what is right and just, and this is what brings about the completion of the will of God. Fairness, equity, impartiality. Jesus revealed his anger and fury at injustice and exploitation in religion and economics when he turned over the tables in the temple. I am aware that justice is so often differently understood and interpreted, and sometimes it feels as if, as Terry Pratchett said, there is no justice, there's just us working out the way ahead with each other from our different perspectives. But justice, do justice. Secondly, love mercy, or as some translations put it, love tenderly. The biblical concept of compassion and mercy comes from a Hebrew word that literally means movement in the depth of your being. It refers to a deep feeling. There is no deeper experience or more godlike experience than compassion, mercy, and tenderness. We all know the experience of seeing someone in the agony of suffering and sharing their pain in the depths of our being. Their pain becomes our pain and compels us to respond. This is the root of mercy and tenderness. And in Jesus, we see that often it is his anger at injustice which is at the root of his acts of tenderness and mercy in response, for example, to disease and hunger. In the parable of the Good Samaritan, Jesus commends the behavior of the one who showed mercy. And the Beatitudes of Jesus include the words, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy." And humility, the third thing I want to look at. I found Holman Hunt's painting entitled "The Shadow of Death" a good meditation on humility, and it pays attention. The painting shows Christ standing in his carpenter's workshop and is stretching himself. His mother is in the workshop too, and is shown watching the shadow he casts over a wooden rack, prefiguring his crucifixion on a cross. The painting hangs in Leeds Art Gallery. It captured my attention, but more than the painting, I was drawn to the words beside the painting. He made himself of no reputation and took upon him the form of a slave. And being found in the fashion of a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even death on the cross. We have to be careful when we use words like slave here, whether it is used in the King James Version published in 1611 or the New Revised Standard Version published in 1989. The focus is on selfless service, not servitude. It's not about being a doormat. Humility, that's what I'm focusing on. Jesus's humility is reflected in his manner and his ministry. Born in a cave, crucified on a cross, he came riding a donkey. He washed his disciples' feet. He was let down by people close to him and spurned by many who rejected his message. He made himself of no reputation, said observers. What a position for a leader to take. This is what elevates Christ and draws so many to him. People are drawn to humility more than to arrogance. The words, he humbled himself, are translated as he emptied himself in the New Revised Standard Version. Christ reveals and reflects God, who is seen as one whose transcendence embraces the human body with all its beauty, bruises, and brokenness, and who is, in the words of the Charles Wesley hymn, emptied of all but love. So justice, mercy, and humility come together in the striking image of Christ on the cross. The Bible and the ministry of Christ calls for a world and for life and a leadership that is centered on justice, mercy, and humility. So let's move to lessons to take forward. I discern God calling us to work walk and share in prophetic ministries, fashioned by the values of justice, mercy, and humility, and to reflect and to call for this model in leadership and all walks of life, in the hope that God will bring us to grow deeper and deeper into the image of God. As we look ahead, we have an unprecedented opportunity as people of goodwill, of all creeds and colours and cultures and countries, together to build a better world for us and future generations. It falls to us to take this opportunity. So what does prioritizing the future mean? What buttons do we reset? Be human and call others to their humanity. Be hospitable and call others to build hospitality. And always challenge hatred and call others to do this. We challenge hatred when we challenge inhumane and inhospitable behavior. Treat human beings with respect and pay attention to their story. Let go of stereotypes and anything that dehumanizes people. We must together work to challenge those who are filled with hatred for others who are different from them. I am especially thinking about extremists of all backgrounds who build fear of others and hold hateful, murderous intents. We need to hear the message of human nature and the environment around us with the rebuke that if we don't seek the welfare of all, we will fracture relationship and we will do incredible harm and we will not help to still the storm. I support an economy and lifestyle that is not fossil fuel driven. I support Gordon Brown's call for an international fund of 8 billion to provide adequate health for all in every country. That's only £1 for each of the world's population. I support the United Nations call for a ceasefire in all wars and for nations to work together to save lives. In a world defined by justice, mercy, and humility, we can together build solidarities to challenge injustices, cruelty, and arrogance, and build better futures together. We can move on from hatred, hostility, and environmental degradation, share resources, and weave unlikely affinities. We can construct a world where suffering is reduced and dignity of all is upheld, where we are more precious about the exceptional capacity of the earth and our environment to give us the gifts of air, breath, nourishment, and life. The importance of international global relationships and cooperation has been underlined, and this is all essential to peacemaking. Change may take time, but we remember the words of that tireless campaigner, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, which offers wisdom for our times. We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be given to you as well. So let me close. And I want to close with some words from Olaudah Equiano. He was born in Esaka, Nigeria, around 1745, and was sold into slavery at the age of 11. He educated himself and bought his freedom. He was a prolific writer. His autobiography, entitled The Very Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olaudah Equiano, or Gustavus Vassa, was published in 1789. It became a bestseller. In the book, he chronicles his life in slavery and his many journeys as a seaman. The book influenced William Wilberforce and inspired his work and the work of other abolitionists. John Wesley was reading this book on his deathbed. and mentions it in a letter it inspired him to write to William Wilberforce on the 24th of February, 1791, just 6 days before he died. The closing words of the book are what I want to leave with you, but read the book. Olaudah Equiano writes, almost every event of my life made an impression on my mind and influenced my conduct. I early accustomed myself to look for the hand of God in the minutest occurrence and to learn from it a lesson of morality and religion. And in this light, every circumstance I have related was to me of importance. After all, what makes any event important unless by its observation we become better and wiser and learn to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly before God. Thank you. Thank you for attention. Bless you. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you very much indeed, Inderjit. Such a powerful, powerful lecture. I'm going to let you just take your breath and grab a drink. Thank you very much to everyone who's been putting questions into the Q&A. I don't think we're going to, well, we ought to be staying here all evening, to be honest, to be getting through all of these. Inderjit, I'm going to probably kind of group them into pairs or so and let you answer them in that way, if that's okay. But my apologies to the people who've constructed such brilliant questions if we don't have time to get to them. So let's see how we go, shall we?
Yeah.
Can we start first of all with the question of racism, particularly racism in the church? Rachel Bergin asked the question, very pointed one. Pretty much all the people I know who are vocally speaking out against Black Lives Matter movement are white church-going Christians. It seems institutional racism runs deep in this church. How on earth do we respond to this? And related to that, but slightly at the other end, Laura Cook asked, how can we as a church then authentically respond to the pain and suffering being expressed through the Black Lives Matter movement rather than just performatively or posing to express our solidarity?
Thank you. Very important questions. I tried to address some of that in the lecture I've given. And as I said, I think for me, the first thing I want to say is just treat human beings as human beings. We're all human beings, whatever the color of our skin. And it is unacceptable to treat anybody as less than human. It is not good to stereotype and to label and to lump people together in one way. And to work with people from a perspective of respect for each other. So look at your own behavior first, I think. You know, when we think about institutions and structures, systems, that's us. We are the people who make all those things. And so we have to look at ourselves. In relation to COVID-19, for example, you know, in terms of what needs to happen, we all have to take some responsibility for how we are with each other now. And that's a critically important thing. I think in terms of what I would like to see happening, it does matter a lot to me that I became president in the Methodist Church in Britain 20 years ago, and there's nobody else from any minority community like me, born somewhere else, has come to hold a role like that. That's not because there aren't people with the capacity and ability to do that. There are. And there are people who have stood up, very good people, who didn't get very far in the process. And I'd like to see us address that. And as I said, at the senior level, I'd like us to see the diversity of us as a church reflected at our structural senior level, not only nationally, but at districts and at circuit level also. And I would say to everyone who is listening in, wherever you are, challenge racist opinions and attitudes. Quite often people say to me, we haven't got any black people here, so we don't have a problem of racism. What that says to me is that you associate racism with the presence of black people. Actually, racism is in here. It's about opinion and attitude and how you think about others. So challenge what you hear and see people saying and doing where you are. I would say it's very important for white people to challenge racist opinions in white people. Don't always leave it to a black person to do that. So be utterly anti-racist yourself. And I would say that in the life of the church, I listened to the debate earlier on in our conference, the Methodist Conference today, and I was very impressed with speeches and contribution that were made there, and some of the notices of motion that were adopted, which call for anti-racist action and strategies in the life of the church. And we need to take that on board. So I've given you some of the things that need to happen in the light of that.
One person's put a question in saying, how do you deal with the backlash once you have challenged racism? And this person says, I've been told I'm aggressive and a bully, perhaps because the person felt challenged or called.
Yeah. Well, I would say do it with grace. I think it's important for all of us to mind our language, and I would say don't challenge aggressive lifestyles and views in an aggressive way yourself. That's not helpful. We need to find ways of speaking well with each other and not holding back, challenging, but I've seen what you just said, Rachel, in that question. I have seen when white people have challenged racist behavior, they have taken quite a bit of flack themselves. So it's not easy for white people to do this any more than it is for black people. And for black people, when you challenge racism, okay, I have a 40-year experience of that. You require considerable resilience within yourself to keep going in spite of backlash and the abuse that comes back to you. Do not be weary of challenging injustice and bad behavior.
And then another interesting question from Peter Barber related to this slightly. As individuals and communities confronted with deep wrongs and evil, how can we avoid crossing the red line between righteous anger and hatred ourselves?
Yeah, that's a fair point. And I think I would look at the motivation for what is your anger about? And the anger of Jesus I referred to earlier was at injustice in the economy and also in religion. He was inside a temple when he was turning over the tables, and also when he was faced with disease and with hunger. And I think that when you're challenging injustice in that way, I think you are, which is hurting people, and especially people who are the most fragile and the poorest and the most vulnerable. When you are speaking out, when those who are hurting don't have a voice themselves, you are expressing a holy outrage. I think that it is important how we do this. I can tell you that, some years ago, I was very angry when some asylum seekers in a detention center in Yarlswood, for the way they were being treated. They went on a hunger strike. And hidden, nobody knew about them, but they were going through a really bad time. It was infuriating, and it did create in me a great sense of fury and anger. And so I thought, what do I do? I wrote a letter to the Prime Minister, and then I thought, well, what will this do? I can send a letter, put a first-class stamp on it, but I decided to walk to London from Sheffield to hand deliver the lecture. That's how much anger there was in me. And it took me 30 days to walk during the period of Lent. And all along the way, I spoke with people and gave interviews in local media to say what I was doing, which was a mad thing to do because there was something mad that was happening. And I think that, you know, so we have to think about how we do it. And there were people who felt that, yeah, that was a stupid thing to do and a mad thing to do. But I knew within me that I was representing people who were hidden from sight, who had no voice, and whom I could represent. And that's the distinction I would draw between the two kinds of, you know, anger and righteousness Peter speaks of.
Thank you. I think a couple of questions, if that's okay, related to the non-violence. So talking about peacemaking, you've led a number of pilgrimages, I think, haven't you? And Clive Fowle asked about what you specifically learned from pilgrimages to Ireland, Croatia, and India about peacemaking.
Well, the key thing is to learn from people who have been caught up in the midst of conflict and violence, and who have had to live through deep kind of things we're talking about, insults and abuse, and more than that, having, you know, bullets flying all around them. And it's important to go to them, meet with them where they are. It costs to get there. It takes time. It requires a considerable commitment from you, but it's important to sit with people and to listen to them. And Clive, who has asked the question, will recall when we were in Croatia. I'll never forget somebody saying, because they were speaking to clergy, a question from a member of the clergy like Clive. So what is the role of the clergy in these situations of conflict? And the answer that was given clearly was, preach peace. Because so often the people who are the preachers preach hatred. The kind of theology that comes over, is that what I was talking earlier about? You know, those who are like us are all right and others aren't. Pitting one against the other, seeing these people as all right and lumping all those others as you know, people who are less than human and to be done away with. That kind of preaching in context of conflict, but anywhere, is unacceptable. So I'll always remember that message given very clearly by people who were at the street level. The bullet ends, you know, of policies made elsewhere, and the kind of preaching that condoned that, who was saying, don't preach violence, do not sanction violence, do not justify it or encourage it in any way, preach peace. A strong message that I came back with. And in each case, when we went went to Ireland and Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, India, Pakistan, at borderlands. And I think people who are on the borders are always at a difficult place. And you know, for example, in India at the moment, India and China, India and Pakistan, you know, they've never known a time when there wasn't tension there, and we saw some of that. And it's important for us to know what the reality is for many people by actually being there and sitting beside them and listening to them.
So what does Preach Peace mean for us here now? John Cooper from the Fellowship of Reconciliation.
Yeah.
Challenge, as you probably well know, being the honorary president, challenging the world to make peace the new normal as it emerges from COVID-19. What role do you see for the communities emerge from the initial COVID-19 lockdown? And I assume that's meaning local churches.
Yeah. I think it's a good and important question. And I think if there's one thing I could ask people to do, there's lots, you know, join campaigns for peacemaking. Go on, it's lovely to see those We Are Methodist banners or Methodist Peace Fellowship banners or Fellowship of Reconciliation, you know, at protests for peacemaking. And it is about being active. So often peacemaking is seen as a passive thing, you know, you don't do anything. And I think one of the things that maybe people in peacemaking organizations have to think about, and peace activists have to think about, is that when you say I'm a pacifist, it often seems like I'm a passivist. I'm a passive person, which is not a very good understanding. And what I'd like to say is that we should look at a more active role that we can play. And I think that the most important active role for us to play in our world, which is riven with violence. You know, there's been an attack in Karachi today, and all the knife attacks and gun killings and murders which are happening at local communities. Domestic abuse, which we have seen during lockdown period, increasing, you know, all kinds of abuse. So I want to say what the world needs is to learn the art of non-violence, to learn to relate to each other without being violent, whether that's verbally or in terms of weapons and wars. Even a question on racism, which is about how we talk with each other. I think, so we have to think about non-violent language, non-violent action. So my challenge to Fellowship of Reconciliation, to Methodist Peace Fellowship, all peace organizations, and maybe to work with joint public issues team, you know, to look at how we can build resources for local churches, church members, to explore the whole idea of non-violence. And I'd like to see that taught in schools. It should be on the school curriculum. We really need, as we come out of lockdown, look at what's happening as people come out of what the Prime Minister said, hibernation. You know, there's all those gatherings where there's violence in street parties. We must, as churches, one role we can play at street level, at national, local, regional, international levels, is to promote the whole concept and idea of non-violent ways of living with each other and non-violent relationships across the nations. War is such an outdated conflict resolution strategy and so costly. Let's look at resolving conflict without resorting to weapons, and let's look at how we and conflict, congregational conflict, personal relationships, conflicts in non-violent ways. In my City of Sanctuary work, I've come across ancient tradition of the sanctuary churches. A sanctuary church 1,000 years ago had a chair in it called a frit stool, and if you were in danger, you could, the minister would sit there and enable feudal conflicts to be resolved by talking with each other. It'd be nice to have a chair like that in every church. It'd be good to create spaces, is what I mean, safe spaces in which difficult conversations can take place. And there are difficult conversations in relationships, black, white, men, women, different sexual orientation, all of us, we need to talk with each other. And rather than just rubbish each other and say, you're different from me, I can't be with you, let's talk with each other in courteous, respectful, open, honest, and non-violent conversation and dialogue. In churches should be at the forefront of resources like that.
Thank you. So every church needs its fritstool or its circle of fritstool. I like that.
Safe space, yes.
Spaces. We've had a number of questions in around climate change, and particularly on, well, they're not particularly on plastic, they're framed around plastic. So
yes.
Sapizilla asks about the stories that we're hearing about plastic waste and toxic waste being shipped off developing countries, and the injustice that what stands can we take about that? Peter Barber raises the question that actually COVID-19 seems to have been a bit of a break in the road. We felt like we were making progress beforehand. COVID-19 seems to have set us back significantly. He says, my fear is that with the economic crisis, we'll have to face the issue of climate change will be lost. How might we ensure that it's not lost?
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think we must continue to regard it as a crisis, in the words of Greta Thunberg. We mustn't move away from it. At our personal levels, I want to say we should opt for non-plastic alternatives. I really think we shouldn't make plastic anymore. It's not biodegradable, and nearly all of the plastic that's been created is still with us. So I want to say to people, a simple thing we can do is don't buy plastic. And I know everything comes in a kind of wrapping and all that, but go to your local marketplace and buy fresh fruit and veg from there without the plastic covering. And don't buy water and drinks in plastic bottles. You take your own water, take your own drink with you. You don't have to, whenever you go out, you don't have to buy a coffee in somebody else's cup. Take your own cup with you if you want to buy a coffee, and go digital when you buy music or movies. And I refer to plastic on streets when we go out for a walk. All that literally, we can all help to clean it up. So compost more, consume less, power down, travel less, and keep the pressure on for climate change. Don't let us take our attention be distracted away from that. And I would like to see carbon emission-free lifestyles long before the date of 2050. We need to put the pressure on to move that forward much, much closer to us than 2050 is. It's urgent, and it is a crisis, and we need to treat it like that.
We're nearly at the end of our time, Inderjit, and there are so many questions we haven't been able to answer, I'm afraid. So I'm just going to pick two, and perhaps I would like you to give really short answers to them.
Yeah.
You want to leave us with a few thoughts at the end. So Neil Johnson asks, how should we be encouraging and equipping people to fulfil their vocation through politics and community activism, is the first question. And, well, why don't you answer that one and the second one, because I've lost it.
So you're okay. I mean, I think that gives me an opportunity to say thank you to Joint Public Issues team for the work you do in resourcing churches. And I would like churches to become more aware of all the resources you produce and put out to us, and that's a good way of engaging with the political issues of our time to support your work. That's a quick short answer. And
I didn't pay you to do that either, thank you.
and that's ecumenically, isn't it, with all the partners of the team
working together. Final question from David. You referred to the Martin Luther King quote about the arc of the moral universe. He says he has difficulty seeing the arc of the moral universe today, but where would you see it? Where do you see it particularly?
Where are we in the arc?
Where do you see the arc of the moral universe particularly today?
Where do I see it? That's what I was trying to address particularly. For me, the arc, we are at the top of the arc, and I think we go this way or this way on hatred and climate change. Those are the two big things for me, to really challenge the hatred between human beings, and to create to treat each other as human beings, and to really address the whole. I saw somebody saying earlier, it's more than plastic. It's not just plastic. You know, it is the climate change. It's the whole idea of climate change and climate degradation. We need to constantly keep our attention on that. As Christian people, the Bible begins with the story of creation being pronounced good, and the very first commandment of God, as I said, it is a commandment to take care of the earth, to tread softly and with respect on earth, and to protect the environment, because in its welfare, so in each other's welfare is our welfare, and in the welfare of the environment and the earth around us is our welfare. In the end, it is about everyone being safe. And Martin Luther King also used to say, no one is free until everyone is free. And I want to say, no one is safe until everyone is safe. It is, after all, these issues, they are about all of us.
Thank you. Now, Kathy Slater asked, is there anything practical to do, seeing as we can't meet as churches? Did you want to give us a couple of practical things that we might be able to do?
Well, keep connected with each other. I mean, we are a connection. I like that word. And I think one of the good things that's happened is people have actually made time to phone each other, and these Zoom meetings and conversations and congregations. You know, we have discovered a way in our days of social distances, from our distances, to be social, you know, to keep connected with each other. So I would say, keep that connection going, and please be mindful of those who are not, you know, who don't have access to the internet, and we need to still find ways of keeping them in mind, and perhaps going to them and knocking on their door and keeping in touch with people. The thing I'm doing at my little church in Sheffield, every Wednesday, I sit outside the chapel with a candle lit at 11 o'clock in the morning for an hour. And it's a way of saying, you're in my prayers, and you'd be amazed at how many people stop there and pause for prayer. And I think what COVID-19 has done is to send us out into the streets to be the church. That's the best place to be church. It has shown us that church in the end is not bricks and mortar. It's the body of Christ. It's blood and bones, flesh and all of us made in the beautiful image of God.
Amen. Inderjit, thank you very much for giving the 2020 Beckly Lecture. You possibly had one of the biggest titles we've ever had or the widest ranging title for a Beckly Lecture, but you've responded with yourself, and you've reminded us of the need to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with God. Thank you, and every blessing as you continue to live these words. Thank you to everybody who's attended the lecture. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you've got any questions or comments, please do email us on inquiries@publicissues.org.uk or tweet us at Public Issues. We're going to finish tonight with one of our current campaigns.
Thank you.
I haven't seen it already. It's a reminder that we all need to stay alert to justice. Thank you very much for coming along this evening.
Stay alert to poverty.
We know that families locked in poverty are under increasing pressure, and food banks tell us more children are going hungry.
Low-income families are more likely to become seriously ill with COVID-19 and even die of it.
We must stay alert to poverty, tackling the pressures it puts on families today, and as the crisis passes, making the right decisions to build an economy where families thrive and food banks can close.
Stay alert to racial justice.
We know that people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds have been hit hardest by COVID-19 and are more likely to have become seriously ill or died from the virus.
People from BAME backgrounds are overrepresented in vital but low-paid and high-risk jobs like health and social care.
We must stay alert to racial justice, sharing the risks and rewards of reopening the economy fairly, making the right decisions to create a society where every person can flourish.
Stay alert to the planet.
We know that before COVID-19, the climate crisis was already having devastating effects, from flooding in the UK to whole communities being destroyed in the Pacific.
We must stay alert to the planet. Together we can restart the economy in the right way that both protects the environment and enables people to thrive.
Stay alert to justice.
We know this is only the beginning. As we go through the crisis together, we must stay alert to justice.
COVID-19 has brought huge changes to all our lives, and inequalities mean that some people have been hit even harder than others.
The world on the other side of the lockdown will be different. If we stay alert to justice, we can make the right choices about how to move on.
Where everyone's story and experience is heard and helps shape our future together.
For God said, "Let justice flow like a river and righteousness like a never-ending stream."
Mm-hmm.